عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد. راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا عاش.
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا،
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية،
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The World Tonight. And you join me on a cold and windy evening in South Manchester, as I imagine it is much of the way across the north of England, and perhaps in the rest of this foul and most perfidious Albion, as always. So, it is the 20th of January, and it is 22:40 Greenwich Mean Time, and we are live, coming to you with several stories tonight, including, of course, the apparent, though unconfirmed as yet, sacking of Zaluzhny in Ukraine. And I'm going to be talking about that and a couple of other things related to the Ukraine war, of course. And also, we've got stories about Yemen, about Iraq, about Netanyahu giving the game away, and some overall reflections on where things are going. But first of all, I will just complete the process of advertising this stream to various interested parties. And by that I don't mean the FBI, MI5 or Mossad, though I'm sure they're all watching, at least I hope they are, you know. Right. So, if you've got questions that you want answered, always feel free to put them in the chat, and I will get to them, well, depending upon the subject as we go along. And, of course, we are live on the usual platforms. That means YouTube, haven't been banned yet, and Odyssey and Rumble. I did check out BitChute, but it wanted to charge me, and seemed to be a sort of a libertarian hellhole, so I gave up for now. Who knows? Maybe we'll be forced back to it. And here we go. Right. All advertised in the various relevant places. So we will begin. And let's begin by saying hello to everybody who's in the chat so far. We have Klavek, who's joining us from Detroit. Good, I believe, still afternoon to you. Ali Abduni, hello to you down there in Brazil. Well, good afternoon to you. Good to have you with us all the way from the sunny side of the world. President Jesus, who greets us from LA, and the land, of course, of the great omnivorous vampire Gavin Newsom, American Psycho himself. And good evening to PM, who says, good evening, comrades from this cursed island. I assume that he means Britain. In that case, I am a fellow resident of that most cursed and perfidious place. HM, hello to you down there in Brighton. Lee, good evening to you. Peter, my fellow resident of perfidious Albion, good evening to you. Sean, who joined us from Cornwall, good to have you with us, a comrade all the way from the southwest of the country. And Munis, good evening. And Eduardo, Who says, good evening, buenas noches, or bom noite. I probably mangled the Portuguese there. I do apologize to our Portuguese and Brazilian viewers. And Rian, who says, evening all from Wales, where it is, you guessed it, raining and cold. Well, I'm not that far away from you in Wales. I am in the northwest of England, where grim, cold rain is the defining feature of, most of our days, apart from we get about 1 month, no, not even a month. We get about 2 weeks in mid-June where it becomes slightly warm. Everybody sweats, and then it's back to grey again. And we've got Luca, who says, good evening from an Italian comrade living in Warwickshire. Wow, good evening to you down there in Warwickshire. And Heidi, who joins us from a wild and windy Edinburgh. Gleb, who says the struggle continues, and that is indeed a very correct observation. President Jesus says the weather is lousy in LA too. Can Gavin Newsom not use his unholy powers to clear the skies? Rob, who says, good evening, it is cold and windy here in southernmost Yorkshire as well. Well, something that the two sides of the Pennines share in common is often, of course, the weather. Despite all the other rivalries, good evening to Roddy and Movie Maker Joe and someone joining us called Based Tobias, and good evening to you. Right, okay, so we are advertised in the appropriate places. We have greeted everybody so far who's come into the chat. I have a giant cup of tea to see me through the next few hours. So, we will begin, and we will begin with unexpected, very expected. In fact, nothing I am about to say to you will be a surprise if you've listened to or watched this program in its various iterations over the last 2 years, because it is, of course, almost 2 years since the beginning of the Russian special military operation, which has had its twists and its turns. And I think there's, with the anniversary coming up, I will do something to commemorate that, shall we say, because there's a lot that's gone on since then, and we should really revisit the beginnings of this thing again, just to sort of remind everybody of how this began. But I want to read this to you, and I'm going to stick this in the chat for those who haven't seen this so far. This is from, I believe, a Ukrainian woman who is... Well, I think she's either Ukrainian or Eastern European, and has been in and out of Ukraine recently. She's called Maria Maciucic, and she's posted evidence that she's been to Ukraine. She certainly seems to have a detailed description of what is going on there. So I think it's fair to say that the testimony that I'm about to read out to you is reliable, and it accords with other testimony of people who visited Ukraine and have been able to publish their thoughts. Certainly you won't be seeing this in the New York Times anytime soon, or The Guardian. So read that, but I am going to read it out just to put it on the record, so to speak, and for the benefit of those listening on the audio version of this. So this comment from this woman, Maria Maciucic, who's just got back from Ukraine. This was posted just the other day on Twitter, or X, as Elon insists we should call it, but then again, who cares what he thinks? He doesn't really own it anyway. So this tweet reads as follows. I just got back from Ukraine, where I was visiting some friends. Everything we have heard about what's happening in Ukraine is a lie. The reality is darker, bleaker, and unequivocally hopeless. There is no such thing as Ukraine winning this war. By their estimates, they have lost over 1 million of their sons, fathers, and husbands. An entire generation is gone. Even in the southwest, where anti-Russian sentiment is so long-standing, citizens are reluctant or straight-up scared to publicly criticize Zelensky. They will go to jail. In every village and town, the streets, shops, and restaurants are mostly absent of men. The few men who remain are terrified of leaving their homes for fear of being kidnapped into conscription. Some have resorted to begging friends to break their legs to avoid service. Army search parties take place early in the morning, when men leave their homes to go to work. They ambush and kidnap them off the streets, and within 3 to 4 hours, they get enlisted in the army and taken away straight to the front lines with minimal or no training at all. It is a death sentence. It is getting worse every day. Where I was staying, a dentist had just been taken by the security forces on his way to work, leaving behind 2 small children. Every day, 3 to 5 dead bodies keep arriving from the front lines. Mothers and wives fight tooth and nail with the armed forces, beg and plead not to have their men taken away. They try bribing, which sometimes works, but most of the time they are met with physical violence and death threats. The territory celebrated as having been won back from Russia has been reduced to rubble and is uninhabitable. Regardless, there is no one left to live there, and displaced families will likely never return. They see the way the war has been reported at home and abroad. It is a joke and propaganda, they say. Look around, is this winning? Worse, some have been hoaxed into believing that once Ukrainian forces are exhausted, American soldiers will come in to replace them and win the war. There is no ambiguity in these people. The war was for nothing, a travesty. The outcome always was and is clear. The people are hopeless, utterly destroyed, and living in an unending nightmare. They are pleading for an end, any end, most likely the same peace that could have been achieved 2 years ago. In their minds, they have already lost, for their sons, fathers, and husbands are gone, and their country has been destroyed. There is no victory that can change that. Make no mistake, they are angry with Putin, but they are also angry with Zelensky in the West. They have lost everything, worst of all, hope and faith, and cannot comprehend why Zelensky wishes to continue the current trajectory, and one of human devastation. I didn't witness the war, but what I saw was absolutely heartbreaking. Shame on the people, regardless of their intention, to have supported this war, and shame on the media for continuing to lie about it. And that's from a woman called Maria Maciucic, who later posted evidence that she had indeed been in Ukraine. Now, I read that out because I think she's written a pretty powerful testimony there. It is testimony which is confirmed in terms of the actions of the military press gangs in Ukraine. We've got a ton of video evidence of how they are acting and how they abduct people from the streets. An old family story that my grandfather told me was that the reason why the Scottish side of my family fled from Aberdeen in the early 19th century was to flee the naval recruiting parties that would knock you on the head in the local tavern, and you'd wake up chained to a cannon on a Royal Naval vessel. This is in the era of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, that was done away with, I believe, by the middle of the 19th century. But this is essentially a modern version of the old press gang from the British Royal Naval history. It's but perhaps even more barbaric, because the old Royal Naval sailor probably had a higher rate of survival than the poor bastards who are being abducted and press ganged and forced by bayonet and gunpoint into the trenches to simply act as a meat shield now against the Russians. And I also wanted to read it because I wanted to bring up a point about a word we use a lot here on this channel, and that word is, of course, comprador. And I think it's worth just pausing for a moment to dwell on the full horrible reality of what that means, because it's an easy word to chuck around. Perhaps I'm guilty of it as much as anybody, but the full horror of it is in full display on in that quote I've just read out to you from that woman called Maria about what has been done to Ukraine. Because what is being done to Ukraine, and again, this is confirmed by multiple sources, not just that tweet I just read out, about the level of casualties is estimated as being anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million dead. The lower end is 500,000, the higher end is 1 million. They think much more than that have been, of course, inflicted with life-changing injuries, though some of them are, of course, being packed off to the front. We've seen men with Down syndrome forced into trenches. Why? They wouldn't be able to cope with the horrors there, even less so than some poor bastard in his 70s who gets shoved in there. So the question of why this is continuing is directly related to the nature of compradors, which is what is the best description for, of course, the utterly parasitic capitalist class that seized power in Ukraine following the counter-revolution of 1991. Of course, they were led initially, politically speaking, by a man named Leonid Kravchuk, the first so-called president of Ukraine. He was rapidly replaced by an even worse character, a man named Leonid Kushma, who was a despicable criminal of the worst kind, who repeatedly rigged elections with the full approval of the imperialists, of course. But it is men like that and the domestic oligarchy, men like Kolomoisky, but a whole host of others, who not only proved completely incapable of doing anything positive with the enormous industrial legacy that they inherited from the Soviet Union, but more than that, worse than that, they relentlessly, or at least a faction of them did, the most powerful faction of them, or at least the most determined and well-organized faction, supported by US imperialism, of course, pursued a line that not only had ruined the country before 2014. I mean, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian proletariat knew that the country was being destroyed. That's why they voted all the way through the 90s for the Communist Party that was kept out of power by ballot rigging, by vote rigging, by all kinds of chicanery presided over by Kushma. And the Ukrainian people desperately wanted to get rid of his totally corrupt system that was dragging the country down into ruin for years. But without the Communist Party being able to take power or able to act in a way that wasn't bound by legalism, all that happened was, of course, that one set of oligarchs set up some political parties. The more pro-Russian of them had the Party of the Regions, led by Yanukovych. And the more rabidly pro-imperialist of them had people like Yushchenko, and later on Poroshenko, and now Zelensky, leading them relentlessly towards the what they thought would be EU and NATO membership. Of course, EU and NATO membership was never going to appear. It was all a cynical trick. Now, in 2008, of course, they declared their intention to put Ukraine into NATO. Now, it's worth just dwelling upon what these scumbags in the Ukrainian ruling class thought that they would be getting out of this, because there must be something in it for them. Now, the question of what does EU membership especially bring? Now, EU membership, of course, brings, what they thought, the comprador ruling class thought would bring an awful lot of funds. They thought that they would be able to get money like the Poles did in the 2000s. They thought that they would be able to get themselves some cash and essentially use that to build some fancy-looking infrastructure in Ukraine and rebuild the bits of the country that they and their predecessors had driven into the ground since the collapse of the USSR following the counter-revolutionary coup of 91. That's what they thought that they would be getting, money, so that the country could be rebuilt and it wouldn't be on their dime, to use an Americanism. And, of course, EU membership goes right alongside NATO membership, and they thought that by pursuing NATO membership, of course, not only would it make EU membership easier, but also that they could have their assets guaranteed by American military support. That's what they thought they would be getting. Of course, they wouldn't be getting any of that. NATO membership and EU membership were not to be actually given to Ukraine any more than they would be given to Turkey. Turkey, of course, already a member of NATO, but EU membership would never emerge for Turkey. Nor will it really emerge for, I don't think anyway, Georgia or Moldova. It was never meant to happen. What it was meant to do was, of course, to serve the agenda of the US imperialists, who, seeing, of course, and gauging correctly from their perspective the character of the Ukrainian ruling class, and knowing that these people were desperate crooks who could be manipulated into selling their country for, use an old phrase, a mess of pottage, they could easily lean on them to create something like the Maidan coup when it looked as if they weren't going to get their way. Bear in mind, Ukraine was, of course, a member of the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, was meant to be a common trading area, with Belarus and Russia. And it's a curious comparison to make with Belarus because, of course, Belarus, no matter what criticisms there are of the rule of Lukashenko, has, of course, not gone down this route. It wasn't devastated, deindustrialized, assets stripped and destroyed, regardless of what concessions that Lukashenko has made to a domestic capitalist class, and there have been some, too many in the view of many Belarusian communists, and I would of course agree with them. But one of the things that Lukashenko's rather Bonapartist rule didn't do was deindustrialize and destroy the country, which is what the Ukrainian oligarchs did. And of course, I think the idea of the imperialists was that once they gained Ukraine and once they had that under their control, then of course Belarus would swiftly follow. They would make it easier to operate there. But Lukashenko and ultimately Putin himself proved too wily for them, and that was prevented. But Ukraine was of course being destroyed by the time we get to 2014. And ever since 2014, what you have seen is this absolute increasingly obscene gap between the image portrayed in the West, especially since 2022, and the reality, which is that the imperialists have, via their insistence upon this war, created an absolute horror, a horror that we, the bulk of us in the West, the bulk of the people in Britain, will just simply not know about because it's never presented to them. Ukraine barely makes the news anymore in Britain. I generally avoid the bourgeois news. I have to listen to it because I do this program, but I try and limit it to half an hour a day. Any more than that, and you would go insane. But that's been relegated slowly but surely. The war on the Palestinian people has also been relegated. It's still covered, but it's covered in the context now of rows between Netanyahu and Biden, about which more later. And you would never see anything like that testimony I just read out engaged with in the bourgeois press in Britain, because of course it's not largely, but not exclusively, but it is very much a responsibility of the British ruling class how this Ukrainian project of theirs has proceeded. I won't go over again all of their reasons for fanatically backing this project, but it comes down to the fact that they thought they'd have a chance of regime change in Russia, a regime change that they have desired for over 20 years, ever since it became clear that Putin was building something that wasn't just going to be a pathetic puppet state, which is all they were prepared to allow Russia to be. And so now, with this desire to continue this war at all costs, because it's all gone wrong, it's not working for them. Regime change is not coming in Moscow. Putin isn't going anywhere. He's likely to win re-election. And certainly it is the case that their dreams of Alexei Navalny or whoever coming to power have all turned to ash. And so, to quote Biden himself, and we covered this a little bit the other night, it's not working, but we're going to continue anyway. Because to stop now, in the minds of the imperialists, would be to A, admit defeat and risk being exposed as being even weaker than they've already been revealed to be, and B, they're now just determined, the more sensible of them know that they've lost. They know that they're not going to be able to use this to engineer the removal of the dastardly Putin. They know that they're not going to be able to get Ukraine's forces to restore Kiev's rule over Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, Crimea. All of that's gone, and a lot more will go as well. Their only objective now, the imperialists' only goal, is to just make sure the war continues and it costs the Russians as much as possible. That's their only goal. And so all of this death and misery and slaughter that this account I've just read to you and many others now have detailed in grisly detail, in fact, all of this, they want it to continue. And here we go back to the question of compradors. What is a comprador? Well, a comprador is exactly what Zelensky looks like, or Poroshenko looks like, or Kolomoisky looks like. These are men who are prepared to under the banner of the glory of the nation, they are prepared to sacrifice millions upon millions upon millions and have the whole country destroyed. And for what? To advance their class interests. That would be the case at the start of this process, all the way back in 2014. But really now it's to desperately serve the whims of imperialism. Because the only way that Zelensky survives, not just him, of course, it's him, it's Yermak, it's Danilov, it's Kirill Budanov, it's all of them in this hierarchy. They have committed so many crimes, principally against the Ukrainian people themselves, against the Ukrainian, I should be more accurate there, against the Ukrainian proletariat, principally, because the Ukrainian bourgeois and their foul offspring, they've all fled. Most of them, anyway. They've run as far as their bank account will carry them. So you see the class war nature of this now, which is that the Ukrainian compradors view the Ukrainian proletariat and any of the petty bourgeoisie who didn't have the money to flee as infinitely disposable. And what are they being disposed of in such a grisly fashion for? Well, it's to save the skin of Zelensky, Yermak, Poroshenko maybe, if he's still got any power, and Danilov and Budanov and all the others. The only reason they are still sending all of these men to die horribly, and now women too, in the front lines is to save their own hides, because the only way they get out of this now, the only way that Zelensky and all the others get to survive, physically survive, not just politically, is if they cling to imperialism like a limpet clings to the hull of a ship. Because imperialism's only game now is to keep the war going. And therefore, Zelensky's only chance of getting out of this with his hide intact is to hope against hope that he just keeps following the orders. He just keeps delivering what imperialism wants, which is, of course, to continue the war. And if he does that, he and his wife, if she still wants to be with him, though she will be, of course, attracted to his terrifically modern collection of money, they will continue it just to be able to get an exit plan. That's really the only reason for them to continue the war. Because if they stop, if Zelensky actually grew a spine, a soul, a brain tomorrow and looked at this and could think, my God, what have I done? You know, if he actually was able to do any self-reflection whatsoever, and if he had any trace of actual love for the land of his birth or the people he was born amongst, he would have stopped this at whatever risk it posed to himself 2 years ago. He wouldn't have gone to the Munich Security Conference at the tail end of 2021 and started babbling and raving about Ukraine getting nukes. He would have signed the peace offer that came from the Kremlin in early 2022, regardless of the risks to himself. If he had any love for the country of his birth or the people he grew up amongst, that he lived amongst, if he had any love for anything other than himself, that's what he would have done. But he doesn't. And that's the character. It's not just an individual character flaw of Zelensky. It's the character of the entire Ukrainian political elite. And not just for the last 10 years, but for the last 30 years. All of them. No matter who it is. I mean, whether it's Kravchuk or Kushma or Yanukovych, who I know was overthrown, but he's as guilty as anybody of creating this situation. He allowed the growth of the far-right forces. He allowed, even though he was a very important man in the political hierarchy, he was prime minister and then president, he allowed the growth of all of this foreign influencing operation to go on for many, many years, and allowed it to go unchecked. Now, if he'd have been what the Western press described him as, which is some sort of neo-Brezhnevite official, which he's not, he's just a cheap crook who stole billions of hryvnia himself and feathered his own nest. And in the end, it all went wrong for him. And the oligarchs he was paid to be in the service of abandoned him, and he had to flee to Russia. But he's as responsible for this as the likes of Yushchenko is. And if any of them had had any concern for anything other than their own bank balances, then they would have done some of what Lukashenko did in Belarus, which is find the organized criminals and find the agents of foreign influence and have them all either locked up or, shall we say, removed from the scene in various ways. Because that would have been instituting some kind of Bonapartist rule over Ukraine in a manner of Lukashenko, purging the recalcitrant elements, creating, yes, a repressive regime, would have been infinitely better for the people of Ukraine than what the unholy combination of a completely fake bourgeois democracy run by a clique in Kiev who were looting every single resource they could possibly find and then ran for the support of imperialism when things started to go wrong and did whatever imperialism required of them up to this point. Anything, any Bonapartist regime run on the manner of the governmental system of Belarus would have been preferable to the horror that these compradors have inflicted upon Ukraine. And it was in the Telegram group the other day, I believe it was Comrade CJ who posted up something about the horrific crimes of the white armies in the Russian Civil War. And the nature of these people doesn't change. The people who are determined to defend their class interests above the interests of the overwhelming majority of the population, over the interests of the nation as a whole, and if you count the nation as not just being the people, but also the land itself, the very soil in which you are born and grow up in, and you are willing to see all of that blown up, polluted, reduced to rubble, destroyed, soaked in the blood of millions of your countrymen, then the last description in the world for you is patriot. The only description that fits you is traitor, which is how Zelensky and his clique should be treated, not just him. I mean, if I were Ukrainian, I would want to see all these people gibbeted in the center of Kiev. And not only that, I would harbor within me a deep hatred for all of the European nations, the Poles, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the British especially. I mean, there's nobody who deserves the loathing of Ukrainians more than someone like Boris Johnson. I mean, Jesus Christ. And of course, Biden. And you can throw Trump in as well there, because he sold he pushed those weapon sales into Ukraine. He upped the sanctions on Russia. He said one thing during his election campaign and then bent the knee to this supposed deep state that he hates so much all the way through his presidency. So he's as responsible as anybody. But overwhelmingly, though, the responsibility lies within the comprador clique that has run Ukraine for 30 years and run it into the ground. You see, imperialism, much like a vampire from the old tales, can only really go and have the effect that it has and drain the life out of a country in the way that it has, if, of course, it is invited in. And they've been inviting it in for at least 30 years, and for some of these people who were in exile in the West all the way through the Soviet period, they've been inviting it in for 70 years, maybe longer. So it takes many different ways in which that imperialism gets into a country, but once it's there, once it's embedded, much like the vampire we mentioned just a moment ago, it will suck the very life out of a country. It will turn it into a puppet. It will try and use it. And once all the blood has been sucked out and all that is left is a pallid corpse, imperialism will abandon it. Then this turns us to, of course, a related point about the NATO exercises in Eastern Europe and the hope expressed apparently by some Ukrainians that the Americans are marching to the rescue. They're not. They never were. They're not coming. The British aren't either. They're not capable of fighting the Russians. I've said this so many times, I feel like I'm stuck on repeat, but I think it needs to keep being emphasized. They were never coming. They were never going to move in there. They were never going to fight the Russians. Never in a million years. That's why they cut all their defense budgets and the numbers of men in their armies all the way through the last 15 years. The British army now is smaller than it has been at any point since I believe, the middle of the 19th century. Because, of course, prior to the First Indian War of Independence in the 1850s, a lot of the military forces of Britain were so-called company forces governed by the East India Company. So they've all cut their armies down. They've all outsourced the fighting to Ukraine. They were never going to fight the Russians because they did understand on one level that they probably couldn't and it wouldn't be a very good idea. So we'll get the Ukrainians to do it for them. They will be the shield of the West. As they remember, this was Kuleba's line, the foreign ministers. Zelensky's used it as well. We're the shield of the West. Well, as I said the other night, the shield is there to get battered so that the torso does not and the head does not. And that is indeed what has happened. And so this cynical game they played, and they played it with Georgia as well, but thankfully the Georgians at least managed to get rid of Saakashvili. But they were never going to be allowed into NATO. Because if you're in NATO, then of course you fall under Articles 4 and 5 of the NATO treaty, and people are obliged to defend you. At the moment, all they're obliged to do is precisely nothing. So they've got this fake NATO-Ukraine committee where the Ukrainian compradors go along and say, give us more weapons. And they say, oh, yes, very much so. We'll give you, what have we got left? We've got a bunch of Churchill tanks from World War II. Zelensky, you can have those. Send those in. When they get blown up, give us a call back. Maybe Rishi Sunak will have worked out how to 3D print a tank by then. So the cynical game continues. The piles and piles of corpses continue. And NATO is not riding to the rescue, because herein we have to make an assessment as to, okay, there's a lot of excitement going around about this NATO military exercise that's taking place in Eastern Europe right now. And this is called Operation Steadfast Defender, which is just, every time I read these things, it's just like, it's so lame. You can tell this has been fought up by some like nerdy guy wearing like, trendy glasses and making a soy face in an office in Brussels somewhere. Now, this is to be taking place over the next few weeks, and is going to be apparently the largest NATO exercise since the late 1980s. So, apparently, according to the Reuters story on this, this is the biggest exercise since 1988, and that had 125,000 participants. This has now got 90,000. So bear in mind, now 125,000 participants. That was when, of course, the last year of the Warsaw Pact's proper existence, and so it had 35,000 more men in it. Now you've got 90,000 apparently engaging in this exercise, with apparently 50 ships, don't say what kinds, 80 fighter jets, helicopters, and drones, 1,100 combat vehicles. And they're saying that 31 NATO countries and Sweden will take part in this maneuver. But they're claiming that it will be 20,000 of these will come from Britain, they're saying, including 2,000 from the Royal Navy. That I think that means Marine troops, 15,000 Poles and 10,000 Germans. The rest, I think, will be mostly from the United States. They're saying that the Turks are going to take part in it. They're probably going to send like one guy. They're saying Luxembourg's taking part. I'm presuming they're sending some postmen. So mostly this is going to be from the larger NATO countries. And some have observed that the way in which this is looking is that this is going to be some sort of maneuver to go into Western Ukraine in the event of Ukrainian collapse. Now, what that assumes is that, well, two things. First of all, it assumes that the 90,000 men are armed and ready to go on the borders of Western Ukraine now, or will be in the near future, and that the 90,000 will all be taking part in these exercises at one time, and also that the 90,000 are 90,000 fighting soldiers. Now, when they say, of course, taking part, that could mean anything. That could mean anything from actually doing military maneuvers in Eastern Europe, to sitting at a desk somewhere in Brussels and monitoring it or answering the phone. So in actual fact, is it 90,000 men who are going to be involved in this, or is it something lower than that? My guess is, and again, I'm purely guessing on the fact that NATO's principal victories so far in the war against the Russian Federation have been in the field of spin, principally internet-based announcements. So my guess is that the number of actual fighting men that they're going to have in this thing, again, if you have a correction on this, I'm happy to take it and happy to look at other estimates. My guess is that the number of actual fighting men that they will have is going to be no more than 50,000. I'm going to guess that a lot of that number is going to be logistical support. It's going to be people based in offices working on something to do with this. 90,000 is the big number they've given to the press. I'm going to guess it's about half that, or just over half that could be available to do any actual fighting. So let's assume that NATO's lied about the numbers, because they've lied about everything else, or that they've maximized the number to make it look as if it's 90,000 fighting men when it's not. Okay, so let's then look at point 2, which is, even if we assume for a moment that we have, say, 50,000 fighting men in Eastern Europe ready to go into Western Ukraine, ready to go and block the advance of the dastardly scheming Tsar Vladimir I. Well, okay, let's assume that that's the case. How long do we think that the combined armies of NATO and their 50-odd thousand men are going to last? How long can they sustain active operations against the Russian armed forces, if this is what is being suggested? How long? Now, according to British senior officers in the middle of 2022, the British army would run out of ammunition after about 2 weeks. The British Air Force would mostly be shot down, I've covered this before, but let's re-emphasize, by Russian air defense after a similar amount of time. And you can assume the same things with regard to the air forces of Germany, Italy, if they're even getting involved here, France and Poland. The Russian air defense system is not only good enough to shoot down anything they've got to offer, but the Russian Air Force has, well, we've only seen a fraction of it being deployed in Ukraine, because they only need to deploy a fraction of it. So we're going to suddenly assume that this, again, let's say 50,000 odd men, can be deployed and sustain a battle against the armed forces of the Russian Federation for how long? For how long? By the admission of the British generals themselves, it's not all that long. And that was before they sent gigantic amounts of their own armoured vehicles and ammunition to Ukraine, to the point where they started running out. So what have they actually got to offer here? What challenge can they pose to the Russian armed forces, really, if they want to get serious about it? My guess is not a great deal. And then we go to the third point. I know I said it was 2 points, but I've just thought of another one, which is, of course, okay, well, let's assume that they go in, they look to seize Western Ukraine. Okay, well, what if the Russians aren't prepared to let them do that? As they've said on numerous occasions, that if a foreign force enters Ukraine without a prior agreement, then it will be considered to be hostile. So what level of effectiveness are the military and political leaders of the NATO bloc right now? How about the military leaders? How good are they? Well, most of the American generals have spent the last 25 years doing what? Failing to occupy Afghanistan, losing to the Taliban, committing all manner of brutality in Iraq and Libya and Syria, and failing in all of them. They successfully destroyed Libya. You've got to give them that via the usage of proxy forces, but they failed in Afghanistan. They failed in Iraq. Their proxy force war ultimately has failed in Syria. So what great record do these amazing American and British military officers have. Nothing. They've won nothing. They haven't won a serious war since World War II. And I really don't think that we can count their great crusade against Ba'athist Iraq as anything particularly glorious either. So again, like in terms of the officer corps, the Russian armed forces have spent now 2 years almost facing off against an army that has been trained to NATO standards, which has had its battle plans designed by NATO officers and carried out by their stooges in Ukraine. So not only do you have a battle-hardened Russian army, you have a Russian army that is now much better equipped than its NATO equivalent, that can sustain a very high level of military production. But not only that, can raise the level of military production. The Russians aren't running a war economy right now. They have significantly increased their level of military production when it comes to all manner of things that they need for the battlefield. But they haven't gone to a war economy footing, as some are claiming. They are nowhere near it yet. And yet they have the ability, because of this enormous Soviet legacy in terms of their military industrial complex, to vastly expand production. And they can do that in a relatively self-sustaining fashion in terms of the resources that they will need. And of course they can get additional resources from the Chinese if they need them. And they are apparently already being supplied with shells by the DPRK. So even assuming that they have to go into a siege economy, they've got most of the minerals that they need. They've got most of the production facilities that they need. In fact, all the production facilities they could want. And they've got vast amounts of reserves still of old, but still relatively easy to update and deploy Soviet-era armor, up to, I believe, the later 1980s model of like I think it's the T-72 tank, which is still very effective in the field. And they've got a gigantic amount of artillery still in the old warehouses that they can update pretty quickly and get deployed. What the fuck has Britain got? Britain doesn't even have a steel industry anymore. They're closing it down. Britain barely has the capability to produce steel from scratch. You know, the French produce slightly more, but yeah, Macron's going and begging the leaders of the CEOs of the French industries related to the war effort, the war industries, to produce more. Of course, they're just going to hold their hands out and ask him for cash, and he's going to give it to them. Germans, slightly more of an industrial base, but a gigantic amount of it has been sent overseas. So industrially and militarily, the Russians outperform all of Europe and the United States. Now let's consider another aspect to a potential war with the Russian Federation, or between the Russian Federation and the NATO bloc, which, by the way, will be a NATO bloc without Turkey joining in if they do this. Erdogan is a con man and the kind of person who you wouldn't trust to tell you which color the sky was. But he's doing a lot of good business with Russia at the moment, and he really doesn't want to upset that, and he definitely doesn't want to get himself involved in Crimean War 2. Didn't work out ultimately very well for the Ottoman Empire, and Erdogan's many things, not a lot of them good, but he's not stupid. Nor are the Turkish ruling class particularly keen on such a war, given that they're, again, doing a lot of good business with the Russians. They are the second largest army in NATO, and I would put a solid bet on them not getting involved in any foolishness that the NATO bloc wants to get involved in inside Ukraine itself. So I'm going to assume that Turkey is out and isn't getting in again. So, but let's turn to the political side of it. How strong is the political side? So the military side, the Russians have a very clear advantage, both in terms of equipment and experienced men and leadership. So let's turn, we've looked at a little bit at the industrial side. Also, the Russians are miles ahead there. Let's look at the political side. How solid are the political regimes of the Western imperialist bloc? How solid, not just is the rule of the current leaders, because leaders can be replaced, how solid are the systems? Now, you've got confessions coming in from important characters like Lord Frost, the former Brexit negotiator, who has admitted basically that the credibility of the British parliamentary system is falling to pieces. And you can tell that just by talking to people in Britain. You can tell that just from talking to people who are completely apolitical, who are completely politically unengaged. And you can tell because if they're working class or even if they're middle class, they're getting hit in the pocket every single day. They're losing money and not being able to save very much due to the fact that the inflation crisis has not gone away. That they have seen political regimes and prime ministers come and go, and everything always gets worse. And the politicians in this country, whether they wear a red rosette or a blue one, are regarded by the working class, even the completely non-political working class, who have no political education at all. They're regarded with hatred and contempt. Same is true in France. Same is true in Germany. None of the major political parties there have any credibility. Italy has been crisis-prone since the collapse of the old Christian democracy, and the pseudo-fascist ravings of Meloni and co. aren't looking to have been delivering anything particularly more solid. Spain, political chaos. Portugal, very weak and also couldn't sustain a war due to the fact that they've got almost no industrial base left. Spain, similar position, slightly more of an industrial base, but very weak politically, very unstable politically. And that's just the West. Go and look in the East. I mean, the most stable one would have been Poland for a while, but now they're locked in a political battle between two halves of the bourgeois political factions who despise each other and are trying to shaft each other out in the open. Then you got Bulgaria, Romania, the Slovaks, the Czechs, none of whom are exactly poster boys for even bourgeois levels of political stability. You have Greece, where the population has been immiserated, where, again, the credibility of the bourgeois political system there has sunk into nothing. Now, regardless of whether you have warm feelings towards President Putin or not, the fact is that whatever the credibility issues facing the Russian political system, the credibility issues facing the bourgeois political systems of the West are infinitely greater. The leaders of the West are held in open contempt by their own populations. Now, Putin, of course, been the leader for a very long time. He does seem to have the ability to actually walk around and talk. I mean, all of these things are, of course, pre-prepared by his team, but he has the ability to actually go out and talk to people in Russia. He's held to a degree of esteem in Russia, even if you regard the high opinion poll ratings as slightly rigged, but he has a solid 50 to 60%, probably more, of the nation behind him, and is regarded as a man who's brought Russia back from the brink and has a degree of popularity which most of these idiots in the West could only dream of. So on the political level, Russia is the more stable system now than the West is. So we're talking about a potential intervention against an army which is far superior to anything that the unstable NATO bloc armies have to offer, that is better led by more experienced officers, that is much more motivated than any of the NATO forces will be, because they see themselves correctly as engaged in a war of national defense. And with an economy which is now more stable and more industrially productive by a country mile than anything in Europe or even in the United States, and overseen by a political system in Russia which is infinitely more stable than anything in Europe. As to the United States, well, I'd say that isn't much more stable than the bourgeois regimes of Europe are. So who's going to win that encounter when you calculate it like that? Who's going to win? Well, I will give you one guess, and I think you probably all know the answer. It ain't going to be NATO. And the military men all know that, by the way. Those who aren't just completely high on, sniffing bags of glue or something. So one of the, I've been reading, finally got around to reading On War properly this time, and of course by Clausewitz. And it's a remarkable book of the Enlightenment period. because it's it's a very book very much rooted in the dialectical method, encourages the reader to view war in a truly holistic, multifaceted fashion. And the bozos in the Western capitals, of course, can't do that, because the politicians, or at least the people who are writing the lines of the politicians, some of these people are so high on their own bullshit that they've decided that the infinite superiority of the West will just conquer the Ruskies automatically. And of course, you've got to be high on something pretty severe to believe that. But this is my way of saying that I just do not believe that this NATO exercise is going to lead to the Americans and the British and the Poles riding into Ukraine. They won't. They won't, because the people inside the military system in Britain and in the United States, they all know that it would lead to a disaster, and a disaster that would destroy them and what's left of their power in the world overnight. Far better, and this is where we come back to the long quote from Maria Maciucic that we began this program with. Far better in their mind, the mind of the imperialists, the cynical and brutal mind of the imperialists, to just continue drip feeding Ukraine just enough to keep the war going, just enough to keep these poor press-ganged men in the trenches, just enough to keep them on their feet and dying, and just enough to keep draining the Russians of Russian treasury as they see it, rather than risk the disaster that would be an encounter between the armies of NATO and the army of the Russian Federation, and it would be a disaster. So these foul and wretched cowards will continue just in the way that they are at the moment, and the Russians will continue waging the war as they are at the moment, which is not rushing, not doing anything dramatic, just slowly bleeding the Ukrainian nation white. And that is, of course, the fate that the Ukrainian oligarchy and the imperialists chose for Ukraine. And all of them, the domestic oligarchy in Ukraine and all of the imperialist political leaders, deserve nothing but the most miserable kind of death for what they have done to Ukraine. Let's pause now for comments from the live chat. So, good evening to Martin. Good evening to someone who's called a friend. And Rob says, I'm told that one of my ancestors was killed by the press gang in Portland in the 1803 Eastern Massacre. Interesting note. If you're from the working class, probably many of you will have an ancestor or two in the past who got press ganged. But it's still a modern practice in Ukraine. Lee says, reference to Ukraine, note the diabolical comments from Cameron about money well spent. One wonders of the reaction from people left in what was Ukraine, what their view would be to the West. Well, Cameron is a monstrosity. I mean, he's the worst type of this sort of combination of the old ruling class of Britain, like from the feudal aristocracy, and the capitalist class. He is this smug, complacent wanker who's, I believe, the conservative writer Peter Hitchens said that in a conversation he had with Cameron, he found Cameron to be alarmingly stupid. I think he is alarmingly stupid. He's like many of them, because they went to the best schools. They are incredibly conceited. They are incredibly arrogant. They are incredibly, and that leads them into being incredibly short-sighted and high on their own bullshit. It is really a testimony to the bankruptcy of the British ruling class that such a complete dunce, such a complete non-entity, has been repeatedly elevated to high office. I mean, they brought him back to be Foreign Secretary when he was disgraced 8 years ago following the Brexit referendum, which he lost. So they bring back this loser who's already presided over the disaster in Libya, the slaughter of Libyans and the restoration of slavery. He's presided over a war they ultimately lost in Syria, and now he's come back to preside over two more in Ukraine and in Gaza, which will ultimately lead to the defeat of British imperialism and its proxy forces in both. But yeah, he's disgusting. I mean, they're all just these. It's hard to describe the contempt that you build up for them, but it's never enough. There's never enough contempt for these people, because the only thing that constrains them from doing what they would want to do, and many of them have started to come out and say it, that they do want to conscript people and send them to fight the Russians in Ukraine. The reason why they can't do that is because the smarter of them, and there are still some people in the bourgeois political system, or perhaps more the intelligence side of things, who do understand the weaknesses of their current regime. If they tried to do a call-up in Britain, very few people would go. Certainly not for this war. If they could, that's why, of course, they're trying to float various talking points about, it's Putin's coming to Britain next. He's going to the Baltic states. He's going X, Y, Z. No, he's not doing any of those things. Even the Baltic states, once this war in Ukraine is won, and once NATO has been revealed to be a complete paper tiger and has dutifully imploded, then you will see a political crisis erupt in the Baltic states, where the various sort of rabid characters like Kaja Kallas in Estonia and various others, who have been there and doing all kinds of anti-Russian stuff for years, suddenly will hit them like a sheet of cold water hits a man with a hangover in the morning, and they will suddenly realize, oh shit, NATO can't protect us and won't protect us. The Baltic states will not be protected by the United States or Britain or Germany or anybody else in the event that they got themselves in a war with the Russians, which won't happen. What will happen is that there will be an escalating crisis in these countries, and the current political regimes will ultimately end up disintegrating, and that will be the next phase. It's why the Russians are just going to continue to take their time, and they won't be doing anything too dramatic. They will continue to cycle in and cycle out their men from the front line, making sure that their soldiers are taken to rest and be re-equipped and rearmed and sent back in again, whilst the Ukrainians continue to die in large numbers at the behest of people like David Cameron. And again, if I were Ukrainian, I would have so much rage towards the puppets in Kiev and the puppet masters in London and Paris and Berlin and Washington. I mean, if anything, what's going to happen is when the Russians have finally taken over all they want to take, they'll probably end up with an enthusiastic army of what's left of the Ukrainian population who would actually want to go all the way to Washington, D.C. itself and burn the place down, and who could blame them once they'd finished disposing of the domestic compradors, of course. Good evening to Muzzle Paint. Rian says, thoughts on the NATO reps' comments to us ordinary people about how we need to be prepared, stock water essentials, etc. Do you feel that they're priming us for some upcoming escalation? Well, what they're doing is they're desperately cycling through talking points. I mean, this whole stock up with water shit is just like nonsense, because again, like, they don't have the capability to do what they are saying they are thinking about doing. What they're hoping to do, and this is reflected in that disgusting bastard Kuleba's statements at Davos, what they're hoping to do is to essentially get a political consensus in place across Europe and across and in the political system of the United States to release more money to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian regime. That's what needs to happen for them, because that's why Cameron said, it's a great investment, marvelous. The whole thing with these absolute fucking contemptible bunch of cowards, which is what they are, these uniformed jellies that come out and make these statements. It is what they want is to pressure the politicians into thinking that, well, unless we give up an unlimited amount of money, basically, or as much money as is needed to keep this bloody fast going, then we'll have to send armies from this country, which of course would lead to an immediate political crisis, because the countries that are trying to do that, as I've just outlined, have zero legitimacy to carry that out. They have zero ability to carry it out. And they have zero ability to actually sustain any war that they get themselves involved in. So what this is, it's essentially an influencing operation directed at the political classes of Europe and the United States. And it's designed to convince them to release the funds, to confiscate all those Russian assets, to send everything to Kiev. That's what all of this is about. You know, it's George W. Bush's old phrase. We're fighting them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. They're literally using like the greatest hits of the George W. Bush era. But they're not going to go to marching into Western Ukraine. What they're hoping to do is just to announce a load more funding, and it looks like some sort of deal might be being done between Michael Jackson and the Biden regime to basically fuck Biden both ways going, which is that Biden agrees to restore all of Trump's policies with regard to the border, which, by the way, were pretty similar to Obama's policies, and agrees to fund the wall, and then the Congress agrees to fund the Ukraine proxy war again. And that deal may well end up being done. And if that's done, then all this talk will retreat again. See, all of this is a political influencing operation. NATO and its structures aren't capable of doing anything other than doing sort of political psyop jobs, which is all that this is. You know, it's all designed to get the missiles that the long-range missiles released by the Berlin government, because the Bundestag voted against sending the long-range missiles that the German army has to Kiev. They want the Americans and the British want those sent. They want the Russian central bank assets confiscated. They want that done. They want the funding renewed from the Congress and from France and Germany and other places in Europe. And they want this war to continue for as long as possible. That's what all of this is about. It's all about avoiding having to pull having to pull the trigger on a military operation that they can't do and indeed won't do. Just pausing for some liquid refreshment there for a moment. Right. Okay, where are we? C. Bolt says, this has really changed my view of politics. I was left-wing, but now I'm anti-imperialist too. Well, take the road to Marxist-Leninism, comrade. You won't be disappointed. Good evening to Jenny, who's come in late, but I'm sure is catching up. Matt Randazzo says, the Western oligarchs have been lying for so long, they're starting to believe their own nonsense. Oh, yeah, I'm convinced that some of these people have, someone like David Cameron is a naturally arrogant, buffoonish, and short-sighted and conceited man, as is his entire class, because he does actually represent the ruling class in Britain. He's a very good representation of them, which is rich, landowning type from old money, married into new money, and very supposedly well-educated, as I said, very short-sighted, very stupid, very arrogant. And that's them to a T. And they are that arrogant that they actually believe that their words can become reality. Or that they can curate reality long enough to get away with all manner of con games. Because this is how they operate inside the political system in Britain and in the United States. I believe also in Germany and France too. They believe that if they just keep telling the lies long enough, that either no one will notice anymore or it'll become true, or both. Unfortunately, material reality is coming calling for them, unfortunately for us, because things are changing. Luca says, I'd be interested in hearing an episode on the so-called deep state. Well, ask and ye shall receive. I'll add it to the list. Second question from Luca, what do you think are now the objectives of Russia with regard to Ukraine? It's an interesting question. I mean, it's not just Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if you saw the program that we did recently on the two treaties that the Russians proposed to the United States and NATO back in late 2021. These treaties represent the much broader goals of the special military operation. Now, I'm convinced that the Russians still have these as their long-term outcome, or certainly some kind of negotiation over these points. So it's not just Ukraine. With regard to the Ukraine and territory, I've been convinced for quite some time that the eventual border we will see is the border that existed prior to August 1914 of the old Russian Empire. I think that's the border that will ultimately exist. I think at various different stages, the Russians were prepared, certainly in that deal that was almost made in March and April of 2022. They were prepared to essentially just accept that they got the Ukrainians to give up Crimea, and they got essentially the Minsk agreements implemented with regard to Lugansk and Donetsk. Essentially, it's the Georgian arrangement was what they were after initially, which is that Donetsk and Lugansk would have been independent in all but name, just as South Ossetia and Abkhazia are in Georgia. Georgian government's not going to wade in and take those back anytime soon. And when somebody did, back with Saakashvili, they got slapped down pretty quickly. So that would have been the Russian preferred outcome. Not the preferred outcome of all Russians, it must be said. Plenty of them would have accused Putin in visceral terms of selling out. But that was the minimalist outcome. Now, of course, the Russian calculation there was probably a lot more advanced than it would appear. They knew very well, I think, that should the Kiev regime have agreed to that, essentially agreed to lose, that it would have meant a political crisis in Kiev and would have led to a potential collapse of the regime implemented there after 2014, had they essentially given up their war in the east. So I think there was more calculation going on with that agreement than is generally acknowledged by Putin's critics in Russia. But of course, since then, things have evolved. You've now got a situation where the population in the Russian-controlled areas of Zaporozhye and Kherson have agreed to endorse becoming part of the Russian Federation. They will, I think that at certain points that the Russian government has waited to see if a negotiation is forthcoming from the United States about an outcome that is to be discussed, and nothing has been forthcoming, of course. So at each stage, the Russian aims have evolved. And if you look at the more belligerent spokesmen of the Russian government, such as Medvedev, he kind of gives the game away as to where things are going, because basically what he says sort of becomes policy, not through the fact that the Russian government is just simply adopting it, but because Medvedev comes out and says something, and what his interventions are designed to do is basically to say, well, if you don't negotiate, this is the line that we're going to take. And so now he's been saying for a good couple of months, certainly since like October, November of last year, that, well, we are now going to have to take Kiev because it's a historic Russian city. What they have come to the conclusion, I think, or if it's not been fully reached yet, it's well on the way to being reached. That, again, to back up something that the head of the United Russia Party in the Duma, Volodin, said, that they can't afford to allow anything of the current Ukrainian state to continue in existence, which means, given what Putin has made comments about the old borders of the Russian Empire and leaving out what was old Galicia, the bits that used to be occupied by the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and basically drawing a line at what was the old border of the old Tsarist Empire, which is past Kiev, around Old Galicia, and of course taking everything, including Odessa, all of the coastline, and ultimately it would involve probably hooking up with the Russian presence in Transnistria and probably taking that as well, because essentially that population wanted to join Russia 30 years ago and, well, of course, wasn't able to. And the Moldovans have basically abandoned their claims on it now, it would seem, in the pursuit of the non-existent offer of EU membership, the fraud that Brussels is perpetrating against Chisinau. So that is where it will end in Ukraine, and that might take another year, depending upon how badly Ukraine collapses. But I think what we're about to see is the bourgeois in the West are pushing hard for a renewed burst of funding for Ukraine, as I've just spent some time outlining as to how they're going to go about that. Seizure of Russian assets, new funding from the US Congress, new funding from Europe, new weapons from Europe, I think it's the Taurus missile system from Berlin, the F-16s finally arriving, flown by who, God knows, and all of that combined together will be announced in big style by Zelensky. New package of aid, new this, that, and the other. We will rebuild our army. Of course, he can't. There's not enough men or women to rebuild the army. The morale has been destroyed. They will attempt to use this is the Ukrainian side, will attempt to use these big announcements about new funding, new weapons, etc., to buy themselves some morale boosts amongst the population and to keep things going. The Russians will, of course, shrug their shoulders and say, okay, fair enough, and just continue to do things as they are at the moment. Now, it may be the case that the Russians have to take a slightly more aggressive approach because there is talk about the Ukrainians going on the defensive. But, of course, that's now almost, 18 months too late. I mean, there's been talk recently, Russian Ministry of Defense briefings and in the Russian army press about the extensive earthworks and defense systems that the Russians built back in, earlier last year, late 2022, early to mid 2023, when they got these defensive lines ready for the well-advertised advance of the Ukrainian forces. And, of course, the Ukrainians hurled themselves to death on these things. The Ukrainians won't be able to build anything like that. The Russians will probably, if they look like building anything serious, will probably bomb them from the air. So they won't have anything like the amount of defenses that the Russians built up. They will have ill-constructed lines at best. But it will pose a bit of a challenge to the Russians in terms of they will need to give up the defensive posture that they've generally taken, and they are starting to make advances. So they will have to evolve their tactics a little bit. But again, they're not going to do anything too dramatic. I don't think there's going to be a repeat of like Operation Bagration in the latter period of the Great Patriotic War. They're just going to continue slowly grinding away until eventually they reach the point where the Kiev regime collapses, or they've reached a point where they have attrited the Ukrainians to the point where if they do a sudden advance into the areas around, say, first Kharkov and then Kiev, that there won't be much opposition around there to actually stand up and fight against them. So yes, the ultimate answer is the borders of 1914, I think. Though making predictions is always, of course, a fool's game. Right, where are we now? What is the most common uniquely British name, asks President Jesus. Alistair or Nigel? Interesting question. Amongst certain classes in Britain, it's probably... I've met more Alistairs than Nigels, because you get Alistairs are found in sort of the posher areas of Scotland and the posher areas of England. Nigels, there's not many Scottish Nigels. Never met many Scottish Nigels. So yes, Alistair's probably the most common. or more common, my guess is. I've met more Alistairs than Nigels. Nigel's not a big name these days. Arnold says, but we do have Sir Keir Starmer riding to our rescue. Well, that rather depends upon which class you're in, doesn't it? He's not riding to our rescue, Arnold, as I'm sure you know. He is the bourgeoisie's next change of personnel, which won't work for them either. Todd says, they want us afraid always. Pessimism is their crack for us. And if that doesn't work, then they've got literal crack that they can offer you as well. Very true. Compradors, that is the essence, says Frank. Also, the problem of Iran is the compradors, indeed. Rianne, glad you liked the response there. Good morning, comrade, says Randy from West Tokyo. Well, good morning to you. Greece, an EU country, was economically destroyed by the EU, principally by German and American imperialism, and French imperialism, it must be said. But that's very true. Could you comment on the ascent to the concrete in the context of Clausewitz and the fact that bourgeois science does it now and then by accident? Well, what I will do, friend, is take that question and put it into an upcoming Q&A, because that's rather too long to go into for now. Favourite tea? English breakfast, of course. Gleb, to answer your question. Can't beat it for a long live stream, or relatively long live stream. George says, maybe Western authorities are not interested in fight a war against any anti-imperialists the same way Russian and Ukrainians are fighting now. For example, when Romania joined NATO, entire military industry has been destroyed. Romania till 1989 was the first among 10 countries of the world exporters of military arsenals like military vehicles, tanks and so on. So NATO wasn't interested in keeping Eastern European military industry. Definitely imperialism of the Western world thinks a nuclear war against Russia and China. Well, that's a very interesting point that Georgi raises there, which is that the old Warsaw Pact countries used to be relatively self-sufficient in terms of their military industries and used to actually innovate a lot. Now, of course, NATO membership and EU membership destroys all of that and just replaces it with any old crap you've got to buy from the United States. So what that means in terms of sustainability is that if they get into a war against the Russians, well, Eastern Europe can't sustain itself militarily. They've got no production facilities to actually sustain an army in the field. So what was it all for? Cynical profit boosting for the US military industrial complex? Well, maybe. But I think the biggest prize was always Ukraine, and Ukraine was always meant to be turned into what it got turned into. Again, this plan started in its modern iteration in 1991. Ukraine was always there to be turned into this anti-Russian force that would be used to destabilize Russia should the Western imperialists require it, and if necessary, and it all went to shit, then maybe they would be prepared to sacrifice Poles, Romanians, Slovaks, Hungarians, and Czechs, because the Western imperialists, the British and the Americans in particular, don't regard any of those people as being, worthy of life either. They don't regard us as being worthy of life, but they have to be a bit more afraid of us because they still live in the same country, and the pitchforks can reach them readily. Right. Alex B says, I'm sure Joe Biden making a deal with Michael Jackson would make sense to him. Well, I'm pretty sure that Joe Biden will probably announce before too long that he's going to meet Michael Jackson and perform with him, given Biden's current state and mental capacity. Capital and self-reflection is oxymoronic. Well, the ruling class don't reflect. Capital does not reward self-reflection. It only rewards going forward. Forward, forward, ever forward. Move fast and break things. The ruling class's motto. Gleb says, there's so much socialist nostalgia in Eastern Europe. Ukraine was prosperous under USSR. Now it's a disaster. Yep, very true. We've covered over and over again the fact that capitalist restoration in all of these places. I'm ploughing through a book at the moment, I've mentioned it before, by the great Belgian communist Ludo Martens, about how capitalist restoration in all these places wasn't something that the proletariat certainly desired. These were coups carried out as basically a counter-revolutionary conspiracy between the so-called dissidents, who, the more you find out about people like the so-called Czech dissidents, Václav Havel, people like that, the Trotskyites who went along with them, and the various media idiots and propagandists in the West who bigged them up. He's like, these guys were coup leaders. They carried out a coup against the interests of the working class. They lied and lied and lied about what their intentions were, pretending they were going to keep. I mean, for a long time, the Charter organization in Czechoslovakia, I think it's Charter 88. No, that's the British group. I forget. Charter. Can't remember the exact title. Havel claimed for a long time, as did many others, that they were going to keep the socialist economy. They just wanted more democracy, etc., etc. When they knew very well that what they were all about was restoring capitalism in the most brutish and most parasitic form possible, which is what they did. They did that everywhere. Now, the reason why the imperialists get so mad, and why the compradors get so mad at Lukashenko or Putin, is because, whatever we may think of them, they did stop the process of asset stripping and destruction, and they managed to turn it around, again with the active assistance of the imperialists in slapping sanctions on Russia, and of course with a lot of pressure coming on to Putin and his party United Russia from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. But ultimately the systems in Belarus and Russia stopped that process and turned it around, and that's why these both Lukashenko and Putin and the systems they run are regarded by the imperialists as perhaps even more of an enemy to them than the Chinese are. So I think we need to be a lot more open, and many of us are already, about the fact that what happened in the East in 1989 to 91 was a counter-revolutionary human disaster. And we should be prepared to say that to these, I'm going to be quite honest, you get quite a number of moronic Eastern European petty bourgeois who turn up in Britain, especially, going on about freedom. And again, I've told this story before, but I never get tired of it. It's like the one Polish guy that I lived in the same block of flats as. This is about 10 years ago now. And like I'd get into arguments with him at the time, and I said, okay, well, what is the great freedom that you have now in Poland? And he says, well, I'm free to come here and work. And he always, when he got done cursing the communists, by the way, he was younger than me. So I was born in 1982. I barely remember the 1980s. This guy's like 6 or 7 years younger than me. He wouldn't have been born until like the late 80s. He would not remember a damn thing about the socialist period in Poland. But he just kept saying the number one thing, the number one freedom that was the best freedom that they had now, was that he could come to Britain and earn more money. Because Poland was a backward shithole run by the Catholic Church, and he never wanted to go back there ever again. And he's not the only one. I mean, I met various Hungarians over the years who've come here who said, oh, it's great that communism's gone. I'm not going back there, though. It's run by like these god-awful reactionaries personified by Viktor Orban. I want to stay here. Yeah, the contradictions of capitalist restoration. Rian, yeah, I'm halfway through doing like essentially a machine translation of that Martin's book. When I have when I've finally completed it, I will place it in a convenient location that people can get access to. Right, now we move on, and we've moved into Sunday. Just a few other things I wanted to run through before we close out here. The Yemeni Parliament, which of course is the parliament that is the parliament that does represent the Yemeni nation, because it's what the bulk of the Yemeni population votes in, has declared quite correctly that the US and the British and the Israelis are terrorist states, and that was voted on today. So going to do more on that tomorrow maybe, but I wanted to throw that in there now. Of course, it's an entirely accurate description. There's no one who can really argue with it. other things from the region of West Asia, shall we say. Apparently, the Iraqi government has stated that they want all American forces to withdraw. So the remaining, I believe it's about 2,500 or so American personnel. That's the number they're admitting to. It's probably more than that in terms of unofficial numbers. They want them out. And let's be clear, they want them out because of the military action taken by the Iraqi resistance forces. And, of course, the fact that the Iranians blew up a load of Mossad and apparently MI6 assets in northern Iraq, or so-called Kurdistan, the other day. So the Iraqi government, which is of a deeply compromised character, has been pushed by the resistance movements in Iraq to the point where it now has to demand that the US leaves. Now, whether the US is going to leave, of course, is another question, but it does throw another awkward problem into the mix for Joe Biden, or more to the point, whoever the hell's running things in the White House, which is if they now basically turn around and say we're not leaving, then that will only worsen their situation in Iraq. They will be there against the expressed wishes of the Iraqi government, which they have claimed is the sovereign ruler of the country and that they are there at the invitation of. Of course, they claim that they're there to fight ISIS and that they're there to fight terror and all that kind of shit. But there's an interesting wrinkle there. I was reading through, I read the book years ago, and I've gone back to it again, the book by Max Blumenthal called The Management of Savagery, where he outlines the fact that the Mossad was apparently sheltering Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And if you don't remember him, he was the notorious leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who then, of course, the organization morphed into being ISIS. So what was he doing hiding out with Mossad assets in Kurdistan under the protection of an American no-fly zone prior to the American invasion of Iraq? Very interesting question, and one that I will be going back to. So, Iraqi government has finally asked the Americans to leave. Let's see how they respond. But other point is, Netanyahu himself, a man who you wouldn't expect to join him with the chant from the river to the sea, but he's got his own version of it. And he openly came out the other day and said what we all know has been the policy of the entire Israeli leadership for decades, which is that there will never be a Palestinian state, that Israel must rule everywhere from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. So from the river to the sea, one state. Netanyahu agrees. It's very good of him to come out and say this. Of course, this made life rather awkward for Blinken and the British government and various others who have said, lying, of course, that they're committed to a two-state solution, which has always been bullshit. They're never going to get there. But the fact that Netanyahu came out and explicitly ruled it out caused Biden to call him for the first time, apparently in 20 days, and say, listen, Benjamin, we gotta say that you were misspoken. And then, of course, you get those statements coming from the White House saying, well, when he said state, they knew there wouldn't be a Palestinian state. He didn't mean it. There's many different kinds of states. Now, bear in mind, Yitzhak Rabin, in his last speech, apparently to the Israeli Knesset before his assassination, said the same thing, that whatever state that would be created wouldn't be a state with an army or any ability to threaten Israel. And that, of course, is the offer that was made by Ehud Barak, Jeffrey Epstein's friend, to Yasser Arafat, that Arafat was compelled to reject back in, I believe, the year 2000. So nothing new from either Netanyahu or anybody else in the Israeli political leadership. This has been the policy for years. The US ruling class, maybe 25 years ago, would have preferred like a stable comprador regime to rule over the West Bank. And, well, in that case, then, it's something that they didn't get their wish, and now they don't know what to do, because Netanyahu has to come out and say there'll never be a Palestinian state, because his political survival is now tied up with that. And At the same time, though, Biden has to be able to pretend, or the Democrats have to be able to pretend, that they're pressuring Netanyahu to accept a Palestinian state, which they're not doing, by the way, and to maintain this fiction that they're trying to create, that they're somehow engaged in some sort of quest for peace, you know, like Superman in Superman 4. But they are, of course, not. And people ask the question as to, well, what is the American agenda? The American agenda is to preserve themselves in West Asia at all costs. The US imperialists, the reason why they will have given Netanyahu a blank check, now, just to clarify, the American imperialists, specifically the faction that is represented by the Biden regime, would prefer a more presentable Israeli regime. They would prefer somebody who was able to go to the United States and make nice with the various sort of liberal Zionist billionaires over there. That's what they prefer. They can't get that, though, because that form of Zionism that used to be represented by the Israeli Labour Party, that's all gone now. Now all that you have is just various forms of just the most sort of repulsive kind of like ultra-reactionary, fascistic Zionist groups led by people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and others. And the opposition's barely any better, led by people like Yair Lapid or Naftali Bennett. Barely any better than Ben-Gvir is. He's just a bit more open. They occasionally throw in a liberal platitude. Not very much of them, though. So, again, Netanyahu knows and understands the nature of this relationship. And he always has. That's why he's been the most successful in clinging on to power in Tel Aviv. He knows very well the role that Israel plays in the region, that Israel acts as a permanent agent of destabilization in the region. Its job, along with the job of the Arab compradors, is to make sure that the wider Arab nation, and I'd argue that it does constitute a nation, it has a common language, even if there are various different forms of Arabic spoken in across West Asia. It has common religions, the majority one, of course, being Islam. It has a common culture, or a variety of common cultures. And it has always been the fear, going all the way back to the days of the British Mandate Palestine. It's always been the fear that should this Arab nation come together, then it will be impossible for the British imperialists, and following them, the US imperialists, to hang on to their influence in West Asia. And the early officials, such as the man who we've often quoted on this program, a guy called Ronald Storrs, was completely open about the purpose for which Israel would be built, which is to act as an armed encampment of imperialism in the Middle East, with the specific purpose being to divide and create chaos between the different Arab nations, the different Arab countries in the Middle East, different Arab states, to reinforce the rule of compradors, to smash militarily any Arab nationalist project or Arab socialist or communist project that would unify to any degree the populations of the region against imperialism. That's the role that Israel was designed for by the British imperialists when they made the Balfour Declaration and when they backed the Zionist project in Palestine. That's the role that Israel has played since 1948. It's the role it plays now, which is why the US will not abandon it unless, of course, the situation drastically changes to the point where the cost-benefit analysis means that it's just too costly to hang on. But if Israel goes down, US influence in the region goes with it. And the comprador regimes who have tied to it might end up going with it as well, or fully defecting to what the US regards as the enemy camp to ensure their own survival. So they're not giving up on Israel. And also, Netanyahu's objectives and the objectives of the Israeli rulers are the same objectives as the United States. The United States wishes to see the national liberation movement in Gaza and the West Bank destroyed, the rule of the comprador regime of Abbas to be solidified. They wish to see Hezbollah destroyed, and the rule of the compradors in Beirut solidified. They wish to see the Yemenis destroyed, Ansar Allah destroyed. They wish to see Iran destroyed. They wish to see the popular mobilization units that defeated ISIS in Iraq destroyed. All of these aims are the aims of US imperialism. They're just being expressed more openly by their Israeli colony, because that's what Israel can do. Israel can be more brutish and more brutal and more open about the aims of US imperialism than the US imperialists can themselves. Again, Benjamin Netanyahu understands this perfectly. That's why he's been successful. But now, of course, things are looking rather unsuccessful. The strategy of what's referred to as the axis of resistance in the region, I would argue, is working. The chain of events that began on October the 7th with the humiliation of the Israeli military and has led to the mass slaughter in Gaza is playing out now, I would say, as Hassan Nasrallah, the General Secretary of Hezbollah, has predicted in the speeches that he has made. He has accurately stated that the Israelis will not achieve their military objectives in Gaza, and indeed they are not. They don't even control northern Gaza, which they've bombed into rubble. Now they're losing men in northern Gaza because the resistance fighters are popping up out of holes in the ground and loosing off shots and ambushing Israelis in the rubble and the ruins of northern Gaza. And the Israeli government is now widely acknowledged to be lying on a huge scale about the losses that it has sustained in Gaza. So the Israeli army is terminally damaged in terms of its reputation. There's now talk in the rather insane mind of Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, that they're going to go and take a run at Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which of course will end incredibly badly for them. Everybody can see that, but they're thrashing about desperately trying to find some kind of solution for themselves. And the aim, as expressed by Hassan Nasrallah, has been to slowly but surely pull apart the American influence in the region and force them bit by bit, inch by inch, out of Syria, Iraq, and of course ultimately to force the defeat of the Israeli colony, the Israeli colonial state in occupied Palestine. And this is what is happening. Look at the fact that the Iraqi government has been forced to make an open declaration to the United States telling them to withdraw their forces from Iraq. They would never have done that without the operation on October the 7th. Or the fact that the Americans, under constant pressure from the Iraqi and Syrian forces in occupied Syria, are being forced to withdraw their forces apparently from one of their bases. I'm going to research more into this and hopefully come back with more on it maybe tomorrow, but tomorrow's a special show because it's 100 years since the death of Lenin. So might need to do an extra stream tomorrow to cover this. But none of this would be happening, nor would the acclaim and prestige of the Yemenis be happening. And the Ansar Allah and their associated forces, their rule inside Yemen has been immeasurably strengthened by this. The Arab comprador regimes have been weakened by it, which is why they're desperately scrambling to do things to recover their reputations amongst their own population, such as backing the South African legal case or the Indonesian legal case against Israel. So what was clearly a very long thought out and well-developed strategy of protracted war to slowly boil the American frog, shall we say, to the point where it hops out of the water in desperation, is slowly succeeding. And they are pushing the American imperialists bit by bit, again, inch by inch, slowly and at great cost to the populations of the region. But they are pushing the American imperialists out. And once they are gone from Iraq and they are gone from Syria, then we will see demands even rise in places like Saudi Arabia to get them out. Remember, old bin Laden himself, apparently, if you believe any of the statements that were credited to his name were really made by him. But apparently, and I believe this story, it came from a book by Robert Fisk, who's a journalist who did some very interesting reporting. He also did some incredibly appalling propaganda at various points in his career. But he said in his book called The Great War for Civilization many years ago now, that one of the reasons why bin Laden fell out with the Saudi elite, which he was from, was very much a member of the Saudi ruling clique, was that he wanted to see the American forces withdrawn from Saudi, and because he regarded this as offensive to the country which held two of the most sacred sites of Islam. And there'll be a lot more in the Saudi elite who do think like that. And if they see the Americans going from various different places, then even in places like Saudi, the demands will start to be made. Even in Jordan, they're already being made. The vast movements of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle in Jordan, there's huge demonstrations have taken place there. So the argument I would make is that the resistance forces, the National Liberation Forces in the region of West Asia, are slowly starting to win. The wheel of history is turning in their direction. It is turning against the imperialists, who are as incapable of fighting in West Asia as they are in Ukraine. Now, of course, this is all leads us into a very dangerous time, but that is where things stand at the moment. And there is no better time to commemorate and learn from the legacy of the great Lenin than it is right now. And that is what we'll be doing on tomorrow's program, on Sunday evening. And we may throw in an extra one just to cover all the news coming out of the West Asian region. So now let's go back to the comments to see if we've got anything else. Isidore says, "Hi Alex, as ever, thanks for the great show. Glad you're enjoying it." Isidore also says, historically, the benefit to imperialism of the Israeli outposts has been oil and trade routes. The importance of the latter has been highlighted recently. What does imperialism do if control of oil now slips away? Well, I would say the answer is panic, and followed by wild lashing out or attempts at it. Essentially, if they lose control of comprador regimes, I mean, the Saudi ruling clique is already starting spreading its bets by joining BRICS and by collaborating more actively with the Chinese and the Russians. So that ship has already sailed to a degree. If they lose Israel, I mean, the effects of that will be devastating, because that will mean essentially that the 100-year-long colonial project has come to a close. It will be a massive hit for the reputation of U.S. imperialism. It will be extremely damaging also to German and French imperialism, which is why they're all in on backing Israel. They realize the importance of this. If Israel goes down, it's all over for so many other smaller imperialist powers as well, because Israel is a joint project ruled over really by the United States, but with all of the major European powers invested in it. If they go down, then it's crisis time. And crisis time is going to start manifesting itself in the imperialist countries, given the way things are going right now, a lot sooner than the imperialists themselves think. And so we are at the point of, it's a point of departure. 2024 is a year of crisis and a point of departure. 2022 was a year of departure in many respects as well. But we are escalating now, accelerating towards a greater crisis inside the imperialist countries. You see and have seen all of the protests and strikes that have taken place in France, everything that's going on in Germany right now. We can anticipate more explosions in places like Italy. You'll see rebellions re-emerge, or they already are emerging to a degree in Eastern Europe. You'll see, finally, things start to move in a more serious fashion in Britain soon. I am convinced of this. All of the ingredients are there, and the ruling class do know it. Some of them do anyway, in Britain, for some kind of rebellion in the near future. Quite what that means is yet to be decided. So it's crisis time, basically. And This is why we need to prepare ourselves organizationally and ideologically and ready ourselves for potential political interventions in the near future when the level of class struggle dramatically increases, which it will. Right. So, we will leave that there for this evening. We've been going for almost a couple of hours. It's been a very interesting and enjoyable stream for me, and I hope that you've all got as much out of it as well. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Again, it's been very, very interesting. A lot of really great contributions from the chat, so thank you to all of you there. I will now throw you back over to Musical Interlude. If you haven't already, by the way, be sure to like and share the stream on all the appropriate social media platforms. Be sure to join our Telegram group to keep up to date with everything that's been going on. If you want to support the program, of course, you can go to the Patreon page or the Buy Me a Coffee page and enable me to do more work like this. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'll be back with you again. Be sure to join us for our Lenin centenary tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.